Jennifer, thousands of people from Central America are traveling to the U.S. and seeking asylum. What are some of the factors creating this situation?
So, talking about our southern border, the majority of people crossing into the United States are no longer from Mexico, as has traditionally been the majority. The majority are coming from the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America, from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And most of these families, there are unaccompanied children, and there are also moms and dads, or just single parents with children, are fleeing serious human rights violations, but in particular gang violence and sometimes domestic violence, where the government is either complicitous, willfully blind, or unable to stop the violence. And so, while it's hard to give an exact percentage, I would say that more than 50%, the majority of these individuals have good asylum claims, because gang violence, threatening your child with rape or forced entry into the gang, threatening you with death and your family members with violence, is persecution. And when the government is either in collaboration with the gangs, which sometimes is the case with police officers, or is simply unable to prevent this kind of violence or prosecute it, that it involves state responsibility, and that makes somebody eligible for refugee status through our asylum process.
There's instability in Central America is somewhat long-standing, and the U.S. has had a role in that over many decades. And I know people might think that 50, 60 years ago doesn't matter, but
it really does. It really does. I mean, I went to law school in the 1980s, and so I worked with Central Americans during the first sanctuary movement, when people from El Salvador were fleeing a civil war where thousands of people were killed every year. And yet, when they came to the United States, only 1% or 2% or 3% of those individuals got asylum.
Yet we were sending a lot of money to the government of El Salvador.
And we were actually supporting the Salvadoran military. At one point in the 1980s, $1 million a day was going to the Salvadoran military. So you can think about, if you take the long historical view, and we could go back a lot longer to, Manifest Destiny, and to the U.S. expansion into this part of the Americas, when Mexico was...
Or coups that we supported.
Coups that we supported. But if you want to look at sort of just circles, you could say that the U.S. created the condition where Salvadorans and Guatemalans in particular came up into the United States in the 1980s. They were not widely recognized as refugees. Many of them were undocumented. Criminal gangs formed with a very small minority of largely young people from communities that could not integrate because they had no means of support. And those individuals were deported, as they should have been, for involvement in criminal gangs. And those gangs became the seeds of MS-13 and other gangs that are extremely powerful in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador today. Those gangs are now one of the major sources of people's fear and flight to save their lives, moms, dads, and kids, into the United States. And the irony for me is that we, members of our administration and parts of our popular culture, demonize the gangs who have members who are criminals, clearly. And yet when the victims of those gangs come up into the United States, we call them criminals, because we have a zero tolerance policy that defines unlawful entry, meaning without a visa, as a crime, even though if you flee in fear, you are a refugee. So there are some historical ironies that are difficult to unpack, and we're not necessarily going to solve all of that. But at least we should be compassionate to the people that come to give a better life to their families and to ensure that their children will survive and will not be victims of violence.
Well, Jennifer Moore, thank you so much for coming and talking with us about this. We'll continue following this issue, of course. in
Thank
coming
you.
weeks.
Thank you, Megan.